message. The future is not set.
Testing. Whoa, that's loud. Hey, everybody, how's it going? First of all, I just want to reiterate everything that Johnny said is completely true. I go give talks to college students and high school students about career advice in computer science, and I feel like all of the computer science professors look at me with a rash of horror when I don't say the most important programming language or the most important operating system, the most important thing to learn. Because in reality, it is how to be a people person, because no matter how good you are at computers, the best people that you hire in a consulting role, especially pen testing, is somebody that can talk to a human and tell them why everything's broken, but make them not hate you. So yeah, that is my number one advice is the book, learn how to, learn for, whatever book Johnny recommended, highly recommend it. And then also on top of that, just being nice. The amount of times that you can just be nice to somebody and they get you really far, just do it. So anyways, we're not going to be talking about being nice. We're going to be talking about talking to satellites with measuring tape. So first of all, raise your hand if you're a ham radio operator. All right, we got one, we got two, we got three. Okay, we have a handful. Raise your hand if you have one of your HF licenses. Okay, a couple less. Sweet. You only need your technician, so you only need your very first license to do anything that we're going to talk about. I want to stress that before we start talking about this, that in order to do anything in this talk, you need to have your technician ham license, but after that, it's gravy. All right, so we're going to be talking about how to talk to satellites with a measuring tape. Specifically, this is going to be talking about the International Space Station. Typically, when I talk about this amongst friends and family, and they ask, why do you care? Why is this a thing that you do? And well, because it's cool. There's not a ton of practical application to it. I mean, I think there is, but you could make the argument to, your wife, your spouse, your, whoever your non-technical friend is. It's well, I have an iPhone. I can FaceTime anybody on the globe, at any point I want. And it's yeah, but that defeats the purpose. That has a whole network behind it. That has a whole, communication underlying infrastructure behind it. This is, you can communicate using a single other relay point to anywhere else, within probably around a 1,000-mile radius. So when people ask me okay, so who cares? Why? The answer is because it's cool and it can help you sharpen your technical expertise and your technical skills. So in just a nutshell, this is going to be specifically talking about the International Space Station. On board the International Space Station, they have a ham radio that will digipede. Digipede is, it will, if it receives a signal, it will basically tag on some of its own metadata to that signal, and it will then repeat it back down to the globe, to the, it's what it can see, right? Now the ISS, it orbits, not as high as many people think. And so it still has a pretty darn good radius of what it can see. If you were on the International Space Station looking down, you can typically see the entire continental United States, right? So it's one of those things that with a small handheld device, you now can communicate to anybody else within that same circle, right? So we'll go over the how and the why, the gear, the software that's needed for it, really the skills, the timing. There's a lot of timing that goes into this, and how not to be a jerk when you do this. So a little bit about this. It's, if you were to look at the website, if you were to go Google ARISS, there's a web page that you can see all the current individuals that have transmitted up to the ISS, their call sign, all their kind of relevant information, their communication. It's educational. It's all community driven. That's one of the things that I love about ham radio is that it is one of the best communities, one of the absolute nerdiest communities in the entire world. I've never seen people be more interested or light up more when you show them an antenna than a ham radio operator. And it could be for something as dumb and small as some little mesh-tastic node. Ham radio operators love to geek out on all things, which I think is why they make great hackers, because they're some of the original hackers out there. So this will all focus on 2-meter packet radio. We'll go into that a little bit more. And the ISS, it also has some other operating modes on it, and a lot of crew members on the ISS are actual ham radio operators as well. Now, obviously, it's a rarity that you're going to be able to speak to anybody on the ISS. They have very important jobs to do, and their schedules are done minute by minute. But if you go on YouTube and you search, talking to an astronaut or something along those lines, there are, ham radio operators that they have a perfect pass of when the ISS is coming over. They'll be in the middle of a cornfield, and they'll chat with an astronaut for a couple of minutes while they're in their horizon, while everything is set up and oriented properly. Because the funny part about this is you think of the International Space Station, it's orbiting at a couple hundred miles, right, above us. But that means it is screaming fast when it's going over you. I think it's going at roughly 17,000 miles an hour. So when you imagine that screaming across, the sky, you're having to track it, or do a decent good job about tracking it if you want to lock on that signal. And then you get other interesting things they'll talk about, like Doppler shift and what that means and what that does to some of your frequencies. So in order to do that, like I said, you're going to need your ham radio license. You can listen all day long without your ham radio license. So if you want to listen to HF, you want to listen to, any VHF, UHF, any of that kind of stuff, you can listen every single day without a license. It's only when you transmit. And some people don't quite understand why that matters. Well, if you're listening, you're not impacting anybody else. You're not impacting the airspace. You can listen every single day to that. But the moment that you key up, the moment that you transmit on any of those frequencies, now you make them potentially unusable to anybody else. So if you don't know what you're doing, you plug in an amplifier of a couple hundred watts, you can make, that band, that whole area, that whole setup completely unusable to anybody in your local vicinity, or sometimes, for certain segments of the globe even, depending on what you're doing. So just know that is why your license is required for that, and it is not at all hard to get your license. If you've thought, man, I've always kind of been interested in it, and I really want to, it is probably one of the easiest tests in the entire world. The entire question set is online. There is an app that for like 99 cents will walk you through flashcards of all the questions, and in about a couple hours of studying, you can easily get your technician license. So if any of you have passed the drive test, I promise you can also pass your first technician ham radio license. And it's important to get that. It's important to not make the airspace unusable for everybody else. So I think that once you do it, you'll find that it can be really fun and really nerdy, and people are going to ask you a lot of questions. So talking about how you do this, what the kind of different frequencies, things to Google are going forward. This is in the 2-meter band, and ham radio operators, this confused me for the absolute longest time, is that you can see 144 megahertz, and somebody's like, yeah, you mean the 2-meter band, right? I never, ever, 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 ever understood that until you look at this simple equation, right? Speed of light, wavelength times frequency. And so you can swap those all out. And so when people say 2-meter band, they're doing the math of it and saying, oh, well, if you take the speed of light divided by the frequency, that comes out to roughly 2 meters, right? And you might be thinking, well, for 144 megahertz, does that mean every antenna for that is 2 meters? Absolutely not. You can do them in, antennas work well in like multiples. So like, you can say, you might hear quarter wave, half wave. Those are basically that 2 meters. And it's a quarter of, it's a quarter of 2 meters, right? So 50 centimeters. Did I do that math right? Yeah, I did. Yeah, you're doing it on stage. What's worse than doing demo gods is, doing math wrong on stage, especially when it's simple deficient. So keep this in mind that when you hear somebody say like, oh, 70 centimeter band or 2 meter band, that's what they're talking about, is that they're just interposing that with what the actual wavelength is, what the actual frequency is of what you're transmitting on. And so kind of going forward on that, it's on FM. And so all FM is if you think of like a slinky in the way that radio waves kind of work, AM is you are shaking that slinky up and down. It's moving up and down kind of in your x-axis, right? Whereas FM, what's happening is you are modulating the frequency. So you are going, you're increasing and decreasing the frequency ever so slightly within your main range in order to get that communication across. That's one of those things too that I know that trips up a lot of beginners of, AM versus FM, and they're entirely different. If you try and broadcast on, if you try and modulate it in the wrong way, then whoever's trying to receive it is not going to know and not going to understand. They might still hear something, but it'll be garbled if they can't decode it properly. So just kind of keep that in mind that when you're looking at this is the 2 meter band, so 144 megahertz. It's FM, and we'll talk about the baud rate here in a second. So 2 meter band, when you're broadcasting, you're going to do this at 1200 baud, and you can just think of pulses, right? And early modems were one bit per baud, and this is ultimately under packet radio. So if you just Google, look up anything AX25, this is kind of the packet radio system that is used on board the ISS. It's also known as APRS. It's used for a lot of other packet reporting stuff. I'm sure if you had some capacity to listen to it right now that you'd hear it in your area. Packet radio is really nice. I really like APRS just in general because it's an easy way to become a ham radio operator because it's all digital, right? It's all just digital bits and bytes going across the air versus, having to key up and say, hey, this is Whiskey 6 Whiskey Delta, right? And having to ramble it all off. If you have some older, Elmer ham radio operators out there, they know how to say that flawlessly, and that's one of those things that I always choked up, and that's also one of the reasons why I never wanted to be a ham radio operator. I didn't want to I was super nervous, just I'm gonna take up a bunch of airtime, and a bunch of people are gonna hear me mess up, right? So it's even better than that, standing up on stage and talking about it, where somebody's gonna correct your math. And so effectively, the ham radio on board the International Space Station, I believe it's at Kenwood, it uses packet radio. It uses APRS on its own frequency that it will repeat your own signal back down, so it'll digipeat it. So what that basically means is that normally if I were to say, send a message to somebody on the other side of the room or somebody on the other side of the city, that message would go from there. Now APRS, it will make multiple hops. So you can think of that as there's a repeater in between. That's all the International Space Station is acting as a repeater. And what is the best place, or where is the best place to put a repeater? Somewhere really high. What gets higher than the International Space Station? Not a lot, unless it's a geostationary satellite. But ultimately, that's what makes it the perfect place for a repeater, is because it is as high as you can realistically get anything that you can use for free anyways. So if you look at APRS, it's broken down into several frequencies. Each kind of region has its own. They're all still in the 2 meter band, so they're still at 144 megahertz, but they're all kind of offset by a little bit. So that way, you can kind of look at the region. So if you're, in Europe, if you're in South America for whatever reason, you're on vacation, you notice you're not getting any APRS packets, that's probably why. Just go check your frequency. So the way that this works at a very, very high level is you have your computer. I just use a Raspberry Pi, but you can even use a cell phone now. They have APRS apps that you can use. Basically just something that converts the audio that you hear into the actual digital signal that then your computer can look at, the actual words that you can see. So if you hear the noise of an APRS, what it sounds like, you'll never forget it. And every time you hear it in a movie or there's actually been a lot of information disclosures. If you go watch YouTube of certain military, naval stuff, you'll hear that. And if you were to hold up your phone or some other packet decoder to it, you can actually decode whatever they were playing at that point in time. So there's some really interesting, really kind of funny information disclosures that only super nerds that hear that tone and they recognize it. It's similar to the dial tone that you used to hear when you hooked up a dial-up modem. But it takes that plus your computer, and if you can have an optional GPS on board if you want to relay your location. A lot of ham radio operators will have this in their car so that they can do track vehicles, track weather balloons, that sort of a thing. I actually have a really good friend of mine. Before she could get her driver's license, her dad made her get her ham radio license, and it was so she could have an APRS deal in her, a device in her car, so that he could see when did she leave school? When did she do this? All way before the days of, Find My on, the iPhone, right? Much nerdier, but I also thought it was really funny that you have this girl who cares not at all for ham radio, and she has her extra class license. I always giggle about it every time I see her. So again, what I use is the Raspberry Pi. I like being able to SSH in remotely and access it that way. You can definitely use your phone too. And then you can even, I've even seen people, they'll hold up their phone to their Baofeng radio. And so the audio that comes off of the Baofeng will then be picked up by the microphone that is on the actual phone itself. And obviously you're going to get signal degradation in there, but in a pinch you can do that to use it to decode and encode. But typically what you want is there's an audio cable that will go, either microphone jack or lightning jack into the, the side of your Baofeng radio. Now, I throw Baofeng out there. A lot of people, if you're not a ham radio operator, people really hate this radio. It's made of it's not the best quality build, but it's like $20 on Amazon, right? So it's one of those things that I have a love-hate relationship with it. On one hand, could it be better quality? Absolutely. On the other hand, what is the best way to get somebody involved in ham radio? And it's by getting them to use a Baofeng, right? For $20, they can now talk to people, they can now use APRS, they can do a lot of the different things that, maybe if the price tag was $100, $200 for a better handheld that they wouldn't have done during that time. So that's a Baofeng radio. You can go Google it, you can go look it up on Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive. I'm sure some ham radio operator, is going to murder me for saying this, but I think they're a good intro, a good way to start. They're not super high power, but you don't want that when you're just getting started out. And the power requirements to do this are surprisingly low. So I think for my handheld, I use typically 5 watts. That's less than what modern gen iPhones charge on, right? So it's extremely low power for what you can do, what you see some of these other ham radio setups have. And that's another part of the thing that I like is that, kids can play with it. I can have teenagers, elementary school students, they can all use it and not, don't have to worry about, any electrical burns, having to worry about somebody shocking themselves. It's so low stakes that it's such a good way to start. And so again, we talked about APRS. If any of you are familiar with Meshtastic, very similar. Meshtastic is like the newer version of APRS, kind of in my opinion. And again, gonna get shot for saying that. But essentially the way that it works is it works kind of like a hopping system. So by default, I believe APRS, it'll do 3 hops. So you send a message, and that message will hop around 3 times. Each time it hops, the repeater will then subtract 1 from the headers of it, essentially, and then that means that it kind of decrements as it goes out, and so it'll only go so far before the signal kind of dies out. And the special kind of thing about that is that you can have a very small handheld unit, and if your first hop out, so the first message that gets received is up on a hill somewhere, that might be a much more powerful repeater with much more power. It might be in a good position, high up, good antennas, all of that kind of stuff, right? And then you basically get to piggyback on that, that system that somebody's put up that potentially costs several thousands of dollars. And if you want to talk about the most expensive ham radio, you can talk about the International Space Station, because that's what the most expensive thing that, expensive object that humanity's ever built. And they slapped a ham radio onto it, which I think is the coolest thing in the entire world. And so when you look at it, the ISS, as it's orbiting above us, there's a very short window when you typically find it. So we'll talk about the apps and the ways that you can find it. I like to use an app called GoSat Watch. I forget if they might have a free version. I think I did the paid version. But what's really nice about it is that it'll take your GPS coordinates of where you are, and it will show you over the course of the next week where the ISS currently is and when it's going to be, above you or orbiting above you at a given point in time. And the nice part is that you can then basically put it in your calendar and schedule it out that, hey, I got to block out my calendar for 1 p.m. because I know that's when the ISS is going to be right overhead. Or if you're with your kids and you're like, oh, this might be kind of neat, you can, at nighttime, if you find like a good evening pass, you can go out on a clear night and you can see it, up over the horizon and where it goes. Now, typically when you want to do this is you want the ISS to get as close to you as possible without getting into a lot of geometry. That's typically when it's about right overhead. That's also the easiest to transmit to because it's, you can kind of point in a general direction. So basically looking at that, there's a website that all it does is it tracks all the different places that have made communication to the International Space Station. This is kind of nice because you can see, hey, you can go look up these individuals' call signs. You can see their lat and longitude and see how far the active paths that anybody is communicating with at any given point in time. It's one thing if you're like, say, in Colorado to be able to repeat to somebody that's in Nebraska. That's not crazy far. It is way more interesting if you can find a path where you're maybe on the edge of that circle that's basically that it is orbiting above, and you can hit somebody else on the periphery. So you can use this website to basically go over and see what are the other ham radio operators out there that are currently actively using it. And it's also kind of interesting to see other individuals, in the world and, where their communications are coming from. So the most interesting part about this is basically building your own antenna. This is kind of when I go back to, ham radio operators or some of the original hackers out there. There's so many DIY things out there that I just think are so interesting as far as a way to get people involved and get people who don't understand technology, ham radio, antennas. Like, these are all very overwhelming concepts to somebody who's never done them before. And my goal with doing all this is to say, like, look, with some PVC pipe, you sacrifice a steel measuring tape, and for maybe $20, $30 for a Baofeng, they've even come down in price. Like, you're looking for a price tag under $100, you can get somebody to be able to digibeat or send, a relay communication off the International Space Station. And if any of you have kids, my kids aren't old enough to where they, can understand anything like this yet. But if you have, a junior high student, if you have a high school student, these are great ways to just introduce them to the fact that, like, look, you can actually build something and it can actually work with something else out there in the world. I think that there's a lot of it right now where it's just like, oh, if you can't, code this new gaming app that has, augmented reality to it, that, like, you're not a good programmer. In the same way, it's like, oh, if you don't have a giant, antenna tower in your backyard, you're not really a ham radio operator. You don't really understand. This is a very easy, compact way to get somebody started in this for such a minimal cost. And so typically under here, if you have a cell phone already, that's no cost. A Raspberry Pi, and if you don't already have one kicking around, you can just use a laptop that you have. The USB audio card, again, that's like $8 on Amazon. The audio cable, depending on what you can find at a swap meet or at a Goodwill, right? Like, all of these things you can source for much cheaper. This is like if you just wanted to go and buy them online. If you want links to all the hardware, you have the, hold on, let me see. So if you want links to all the hardware, I have it all on that GitHub site. It should all still be up. And effectively what you're going to basically change, and this thing tripped me up for quite some time too, is doing Vox on your Baofeng. So basically what happens is when the Baofeng basically hears audio, or if it's piped through the cable, it will then automatically turn it on and start broadcasting. That's not ideal. Typically you want like some push to talk situation, but again, to get started, this is pretty much what you want. And the way, so if you go look at, if you go Google Legios Yagi, he has all of the measurements. He's done all the math and measurements to where you can cut your PVC, you can cut your, you basically, all you're doing is you're cutting this measuring tape down to the very specified lengths, and then you're just, you could either electrical tape it together and just go from there. And if you cut it to these lengths, you don't even need an antenna tuner typically, because, hey, you're cutting a measuring tape, right? What's the best device that you can cut? One that's already self-measuring in and of itself. Now, if you want to make this a little bit nicer and you have a little bit more budget, they sell an antenna that collapses called an arrow antenna. That is like the Cadillac, of all antennas. I'm sure you'll see it if you Google it. You'll be like, oh, I've probably seen that before. I have one of those, and it's funny because I'll use my arrow antenna, and then the next pass I'll use this, measuring tape Yagi antenna, and they're pretty comparable. I mean, the Yagi that I made is not as good of quality, but it's one of those things that it's pretty amazing that you have a $150 antenna that's been tuned and it has all the appropriate aluminum cuts and all that stuff to be resonant at that frequency. And just to show that your measurements are correct, you can do that same thing with one of these. And they're also great for fox hunting too. So anyways, it's an interesting project. I think you should all try it. Get your technician license if you don't have one. Does anybody have any questions? Sweet. If you do, you can always go to the Secureworks Sophos booth. I got to go run the wireless capture the flag right now, so shameless plug for that. If you want to enjoy the King of the Hill, I recommend checking it out. Thank you, everybody.